She never spoke a word in class, not even when they mocked her drawings. But the day a quiet janitor stood between her and the bullies, everything began to change. Sometimes it's not the loudest voices that leave the deepest mark, but the ones who stay silently when no one else does, ready to discover the story that moved an entire school. Before we begin, if you enjoy heartfelt stories that inspire and heal, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more meaningful tales like this one to life. Now, let's begin. Single dad. Defended a girl. Bullied in class. He didn't know she was the daughter of his new boss. The classroom was silent except for the faint scratch of pencil on wood. Morning sunlight spilled across the rows of desks, catching specks of dust suspended in the air like tiny ghosts. At the far corner near the window, a girl hunched over her desk, her pencil gliding slowly, deliberately, as if every stroke carried a secret. Sophie Harwood was 11. She hadn't spoken a full sentence in weeks. No one sat beside her. No one dared to. Her silence, the distant look in her eyes, the strange pictures she drew, everything about her was an invitation to stay away. But today, for the first time, she was not just drawing. She was tracing the outline of a familiar shape on the desk's surface with bare fingers as if she could feel it, remember it. A stone bench, by a lake, with a single figure sitting beneath a crooked willow. Then came the laughter. Ugly, shrill, and all too familiar. Oh, look, the mute's at it again. 3 kids. Tyler, Megan, and Josh moved in like shadows on a sunny day. Sophie didn't look up. She never did. She knew the pattern first, the teasing, then the grabbing, then the tearing. She clutched her sketchbook tighter, but Josh was already reaching across the desk. Let's see what she's been drawing this time. Maybe a voodoo spell. Back off. The voice didn't come from a teacher. It came from the doorway. Ethan Hayes stood with one hand resting on the doorframe, the other gripping a metal clipboard. He wasn't tall, but he had a calm, anchored presence like someone who'd seen enough storms to know which ones were worth chasing. The kids froze. Tyler scoffed, but his bravado shrank under Ethan's gaze. Youth 3 hallway. Now Ethan said, his voice low but steady. We're going to walk and talk. You'll have your say, but not in here. They shuffled past him, reluctantly muttering. Ethan waited until the last shoe disappeared before stepping fully into the room. Sophie hadn't moved. She sat, rigid hands still clenched around her sketchbook. I'm not here to take it, he said gently. I just want to make sure you're okay. No answer, just a flicker in her eyes. Ethan glanced at the drawing left behind on the desk, simple but haunting. The bench by the lake. The crooked willow. Something about it stirred a memory in him, but it was buried too deep to rise. You like to draw places, you remember? He asked. Silence. But her fingers relaxed just slightly. He crouched so he was eye level, careful to keep a respectful distance. You ever feel like there's a place you want to go back to, but it only exists in here? He tapped his temple. Yeah. Me too. Still no words. But this time, a breath. Almost a sigh. I'll leave you be. But I'm going to leave something, too. He slipped a folded note under the corner of her sketchbook and stood. Whatever they said, it's not true. People who draw like you, they see things the rest of us miss. Ethan turned and left. Outside, the autumn air stung his face. He walked across the cracked pavement toward the main building, adjusting his utility belt, janitor keys, safety gloves, walkie-talkie, all standard issue for a man who did everything from changing filters to calming down middle school panic attacks. He stopped by the office, filed the incident report, then took the back stairs to the boiler room where he kept his toolbox and 10 minutes of silence. He pulled out an old thermos black coffee, no cream, and took a long sip. The memories scratched at the back of his mind. The drawing, that bench, the lake. He had been there once, 10 years ago. She was sitting there crying, wearing a beige coat and red gloves. He never asked why. She never told him. They just sat, two strangers in a silence that somehow healed them both. She said thank you. He smiled. They walked away in opposite directions. He never knew her name. He never forgot her face. At lunch, he stopped by room 104 again. The kids had returned the air buzzing with noise and half-eaten peanut butter sandwiches. Sophie was still there. Alone. But her sketchbook was open. The note he'd left was gone. She wasn't drawing now. She was just staring. And then, just for a moment, she looked up and caught his eye. No smile. No nod. But her fingers rested on the page like it mattered. That was enough. Halfway across campus, Elise Harwood adjusted the strap of her handbag and stepped into the staff conference room. The superintendent was there along with several board members and a spread of dull paperwork. Elise kept her smile polite professional. Inside, she was burning. She had seen the footage from the classroom camera. She had recognized the man older, now weathered with a beard and that same quiet strength in his shoulders. Ethan Hayes, the man from the lake, the man she never stopped thinking about. And now, unknowingly, he had stepped back into her life, to defend her daughter. Elise's hands trembled under the table, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady. I want a full report on the classroom incident, and I want the name of the staff member who intervened. The superintendent flipped a page. That would be Mr. Ethan Hayes, maintenance. Elise stared out the window, watching leaves fall like fragments of memory. Fate, it seemed, was a better artist than she ever was, and it had just redrawn the outline of a story she thought was finished. The cafeteria was a symphony of noise trays, clattering sneakers, squeaking 100 preteens jockeying for position in the lunch line like Wall Street traders. But at a table tucked into the corner near the windows, Sophie sat in stillness, a small island in a sea of motion. The only thing moving were her fingers slowly tracing the edge of the note she'd found that morning. She had unfolded it alone behind her locker door. The handwriting was neat, slanted, masculine. You're not alone. People who draw see the world better than those who don't. E.H. 3 lines. Just 3. But they cracked something. She didn't smile. Not exactly. But she held the paper like it mattered, as if someone had finally seen through the silence and into the shape of her heart. Across the room, Emma Hayes balanced her lunch tray with practiced precision. Apple slices, grilled cheese, and a sealed juice box with a bent straw. She spotted Sophie and paused. Emma had always noticed people others didn't. Maybe it came from growing up with a dad who reminded her daily that kindness wasn't optional, it was a muscle. You use it, or it fades. She changed direction and walked towards Sophie's table. "Can I sit here?" she asked, her voice light. Sophie looked up, startled. For a moment, nothing moved. Then she gave the smallest of nods. Emma smiled, slid into the seat, and unwrapped her sandwich like nothing unusual had happened. They didn't talk, but Sophie didn't move away, and that alone felt like a chapter opening. After school, Ethan walked Emma home. Their place was a modest duplex with peeling paint, a creaky porch swing, and a tired rose bush that somehow bloomed anyway. Emma skipped ahead, tossing her backpack onto the swing before flopping beside it. "You know that girl I sat with today?" she asked, sipping juice. "The one who draws Ethan," said, unlocking the door. Emma nodded. "She's different. I think she's kinda sad." Ethan looked at his daughter. Her freckles stood out more in the fading sunlight. Her eyes, so much like her mother's, were always searching, always open. "She probably is," he said gently. "Some kids carry things they don't talk about. She liked your note." That stopped him mid-step. Emma smiled. "I saw her reading it. She didn't crumple it or hide it. She just kept touching it." Ethan felt something shift in his chest, a warm ache, as if that tiny gesture, leaving a folded piece of encouragement, had reached further than he thought possible. "You know what I like about her drawings," Emma added, swinging her legs. "They look quiet, but if you stare long enough, they talk." Ethan chuckled. "Like you do when you pretend not to." She grinned, then ran inside. He stayed on the porch for a moment, staring out at the horizon, the memory of that bench and that woman rising again in his mind. The bench, the lake, the red gloves. He'd left a note back then, too, scribbled in the margin of a napkin from a hot dog stand. Sometimes not talking is the loudest way to be heard. He'd never given it to her. Maybe that's why this felt unfinished. Like life had turned back a page. Elsewhere in town, Elise sat in her home office part art studio part strategy war room. The walls were lined with color palettes, architectural sketches, and ink studies from her graduate years. But the desk was all business, 2 monitors, a wireless headset, and a thick file marked District Reform Initiative. She tried to focus. She tried to draft the budget projection for the board, but her eyes kept drifting to the open drawer beside her. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of reports, was a small ink drawing she hadn't touched in years. The bench, the willow, the figure. She had drawn it the morning after. She never showed it to anyone. Elise traced the curve of the bench with one fingertip, wondering how much of her past was already looping into her present. She opened her laptop and typed into the staff directory, Ethan Hayes. There he was, maintenance staff, hired last summer, no listed degrees, no incident reports. Clean record. She clicked on his photo. He was smiling slightly in the ID, as if amused that someone had caught him mid-thought. Her heart thudded. She remembered the way he'd listened that day, no interruptions, no advice. Just presence. The kind that held space without pressure. Could it really be him? Sophie came to the doorway holding a crumpled paper. Elise snapped the laptop shut. "What's that?" she asked. Sophie hesitated, then stepped forward. She placed the paper on Elise's desk and unfolded it. The note. Elise read the message twice, 3 times. She looked at her daughter. "Who gave this to you?" Sophie didn't answer, but her hand moved just slightly, mimicking the way Ethan had slipped it under her sketchbook. A silent gesture. Elise closed her eyes. A janitor had stepped between her daughter and cruelty. A man who once sat beside her at a lake and gave her something no one else had, dignity without strings. And now he had done the same for Sophie. Something cracked in her, too. "Thank you for showing me," she whispered. Sophie lingered. Then, carefully, she reached for the drawer. Her small hands pulled out the old sketch Elise had hidden for years. She placed it beside the note. 2 drawings, 2 timelines, 1 bench. Elise covered her mouth, overcome with the truth laid bare in pencil and silence. Maybe Sophie couldn't say what hurt, but she could draw it. And now someone else finally understood. That night, as the stars blinked into place above the quiet town, 3 people lay in 3 different beds, each holding on to the same picture. A bench, a place where silence spoke, and maybe, just maybe, a beginning. Elise Harwood stood alone in her office, the door closed behind her like the seal of a confession box. Late afternoon sunlight slanted across the bookshelves, catching on the gold-framed certificates that lined the walls. Superintendent of the Year, District Reformer Award, Harvard Education Leadership Fellow. Accolades meant to reassure her she was in control. Today, they felt meaningless. She turned toward her desk, where a thin beige file lay, waiting, bland, unassuming. But inside it was a report that had shattered her composure: Sophie Harwood Incident Report, Classroom Bullying, 3rd Infraction, Nonverbal Distress, No Verbal Complaint. She had skimmed it earlier, but now she read every word with the precision of a surgeon. Staff intervening: Ethan Hayes, position Maintenance and Facilities, Assistant Action. Taken removed, aggressors de-escalated, incident notified administration. Her breath hitched. She opened the staff directory again. Ethan's face stared back at her from the screen, the same calm eyes now shaded by a decade of quiet weathering. Was it really him? She clicked through to the full file. Employment, start date. June 2025, emergency contact Emma Hayes. Daughter education listed as not disclosed. Previous experience self-employed art instructor terminated in 2017. She narrowed her eyes. Art. A memory flickered charcoal smudges on his fingers, a canvas in his trunk, though he hadn't mentioned it. Back then she had needed to talk, and he had let her. No advice, no questions. Just space. The kind of space that felt like safety. That bench by the lake, she'd been fresh off a humiliating board meeting in Portland, pregnant, scared, still hiding from her own parents. She had cried for the first time in months, and this stranger, this quiet man with paint on his jeans, had sat beside her and said only one thing. Sometimes people don't need fixing. They just need someone to sit with them until the noise goes quiet. She'd held on to that line like a lifeline, but she never saw him again. Until now. Downstairs, Ethan was fixing a broken heater in the art classroom. The radiator groaned as he tightened the valve. Heat started to pour into the room, faint but there, like life returning to cold places. He wiped his hands on his jeans and looked around. Student artwork lined the walls, messy, brilliant, honest. He paused at one drawing near the door. It was Sophie's. He recognized the stroke, the careful shading, the impossible balance of stillness and tension. It was the bench again. But now there was a girl sitting on it with her arms wrapped around her knees. Next to her, barely visible, was a second figure. Someone sitting close but not touching. Just there. Ethan blinked. That was him. He didn't remember posing like that, but somehow Sophie had captured it. The way he crouched beside her desk, the way he didn't reach but didn't walk away. She'd seen him, and drawn it. Later that evening, Elise sat across from Sophie at their kitchen table. The house was quiet, filled only with the clink of cutlery and the occasional hum of the refrigerator. Elise tried. She always tried. "How was school?" she asked, even though she knew Sophie wouldn't answer. But tonight, Sophie didn't look away. Instead, she reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded paper. She slid it across the table. It was another drawing, smaller, simpler. A hallway. 3 kids. And someone stepping in front of them. Ethan. Elise traced the lines with her eyes. There was no facial detail, but the posture was unmistakable. Shoulders squared, arm out, a silent shield. She felt her throat tighten. "He helped you." Sophie nodded once. Elise swallowed. "Do you want to draw with him sometime? Would that feel safe?" Sophie hesitated, then tilted her head, almost curious. Elise took a deep breath. "He's someone I knew a long time ago. Before you were born. He was kind then, too." That part she hadn't expected to say. Sophie's eyes softened. For the first time in years, she reached across the table and took her mother's hand. Elise gripped it like a lifeline. The next morning, Elise arrived at school early. Her heels clicked sharply against the tiles as she walked the corridor, her tailored coat brushing her legs like armor. But today she didn't feel like a commander. She felt like a mother. And maybe for once that was enough. She knocked on the custodial office door. Inside, Ethan was bent over a clipboard updating repair logs. He looked up. Their eyes met. Elise didn't speak for a moment. She just stood there, hands clasped tightly. Then she stepped in. "I wanted to thank you," she said, voice calm but charged, "for what you did for my daughter." Ethan blinked. "Your daughter Sophie," she said, watching the recognition hit him like a wave. "She's mine." Ethan sat slowly on the edge of the desk. "Of course she is," he murmured. Elise stepped closer, pulling something from her purse. A folded drawing. The one Sophie had shown her. "She sees you," Elise said. "I thought you should know that." He took the paper with reverence as if it might crumble in his hands. "I remember you," Elise added quietly now. "The lake, the bench. You said one sentence and then never asked for anything in return." Ethan's eyes lifted. "I didn't think you remembered me. I never forgot." There was a pause, thick with everything unsaid, everything postponed by years of life. "I'm not that person anymore," Ethan said finally. "I lost a lot after that. My wife, my work, most of what I believed I was. Elise nodded, eyes stinging. "I lost things too," she said, "but I kept going. Maybe that's the only thing that matters." Their silence stretched not awkward but sacred. Then Elise smiled just barely. "We're starting an art initiative," she said. "A mural. Something for the students to feel proud of. I want someone who understands them to help lead it." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a chance." He laughed softly. "You always were better with words, and you were always better at listening." They looked at each other not as a principal and staff, not as broken people trying to hide the cracks, but as two souls who had once sat side by side in silence, and were now maybe ready to speak again. Outside the window, the first leaves of October skittered across the pavement, painting the schoolyard in warm reds and golds. And from inside, it almost looked like the whole world was preparing for a second spring where everything old could be made new. The hallway was quiet after the final bell, save for the soft shuffle of papers and the occasional thud of locker doors. Students had scattered voices fading into the distance, but inside classroom 3B a faint scraping sound lingered. Pencil on paper. Sophie remained at her desk, her head bent low over her sketchbook as though she were building a world where no one could touch her. A place just for her, one where the rules made sense. But today her drawing was different. It still began with the bench beneath the crooked willow the same as always, the same calm lake in the background. But this time there was something new, someone new, a figure. Not just a vague shape, but a man, seated beside the girl on the bench facing forward. His hands rested on his knees, his shoulders relaxed. He didn't speak. He didn't hover. He was simply present. She drew the outline with a delicate patience, as if afraid that if she rushed he might disappear. Across the schoolyard, Emma zipped her hoodie and swung her backpack over one shoulder, then paused near the open window of 3B. She recognized Sophie right away, curled over her book, same as always. Emma didn't mean to pry, but curiosity tugged at her feet. She stepped closer and leaned in just enough to glimpse the drawing. And then she gasped. She'd seen that man before. It was her father. The way he sat, the slope of his shoulders, the gentle hands. There was no mistaking it. Emma blinked and took a step back, her heart suddenly beating fast. She didn't know why it moved her so much. Maybe because she saw it too, the way her dad had crouched beside Sophie that day, calm and kind like always. But Sophie had caught something. Even Emma had missed the stillness. The trust. Emma smiled and turned her steps quick and light as she raced toward the maintenance wing. Ethan was restocking air filters in the janitor's closet when Emma burst through the doorway, breathless and grinning. "Dad," she panted, "you have to come see this." Ethan looked up a bit startled. "See what Sophie's drawing? You're in it." He blinked. "What I saw her through the window. She drew the bench again, but this time you're there too. Just like how you were sitting when you talked to her. You didn't even do anything. But you're there." Ethan leaned against the shelf, a slow, astonished breath escaping his lips. "She put me in her drawing." Emma nodded eagerly. "It's beautiful, Dad. Like peaceful." Something tightened in Ethan's chest. It wasn't pride exactly. It was something deeper. The knowledge that being present, just being, had somehow made its way into a child's quiet world and stayed. That evening, back at home, Ethan pulled out an old wooden box from the top shelf of his closet. It creaked as he opened it, revealing tubes of dried-up paint, a faded cloth roll of brushes, and a sketch pad he hadn't touched in years. Emma watched from the doorway, curious. "I thought you didn't draw anymore," she said. "I haven't," he replied, running a thumb across the worn paper. Not since your mom passed." Emma's smile faded a little. "You used to say drawing helped you think." Ethan nodded. "It did. But sometimes when you lose someone, the things that used to bring you peace just remind you of the quiet afterward." He pulled out the sketch pad and opened it slowly. On the second page was the bench, the crooked willow, and beside it a faint outline of a woman in red gloves. Elise. He hadn't even known her name back then, but he'd drawn her the night they met. The memory had needed somewhere to live. And now, Sophie was doing the same thing, using drawings as language, as memory, as survival. He looked at Emma. "Maybe it's time I start again." She beamed. "Maybe you and Sophie could draw together." Ethan chuckled. "We'll see." But the thought stayed with him. The next day, Elise stood at her office window watching as Sophie climbed out of the car with her sketchbook tucked tightly under one arm. For once, Sophie didn't drift into the school building like a shadow. Her steps were more grounded. She stopped when she saw Emma and without hesitation walked toward her. The girls exchanged a few words. Well, Emma spoke and Sophie nodded, but then something remarkable happened. Sophie handed Emma her sketchbook. Just for a moment. Elise gasped. She had never seen her daughter hand that book to anyone, not even her. In that moment, Elise understood something she hadn't before. This wasn't just about art, it was about safety, trust. The drawing wasn't merely an expression, it was an invitation, and her daughter had extended that to someone. Later that afternoon, Ethan stood beside Elise in the empty gymnasium reviewing supply lists for the upcoming mural project. Paint estimates, scaffold approvals, budget lines. But Elise wasn't reading. She was watching him. "You know," she said softly, "Sophie drew you." Ethan glanced up. "I heard. She's never drawn anyone but herself, or the bench. Until now." He looked at her for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "She's got a good eye." "She sees what's real," Elise said, "even when people don't say a word." Ethan nodded. Maybe, especially then. Their eyes held a soft current passing between them. "Emma says you used to draw too," Elise added. "I did. Once, a long time ago." Elise hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper aged, worn at the corners. She handed it to him. He opened it slowly. It was her sketch, the bench, the lake, the crooked willow, from 10 years ago. He traced the lines with his fingertips, stunned. "You kept this?" he asked. "I couldn't throw it away," she said, "because that day changed something in me. I didn't know what it meant until now." Ethan folded the drawing gently as though it were glass. "We're all connected," he murmured, "more than we think." And in the quiet of the gym, with paint cans stacked against the wall and old sunlight slanting through high windows, they stood together, two artists who'd once been strangers, finally beginning the first sketch of something new. The Monday morning hallway buzzed with its usual clamor-slamming lockers, squeaky sneakers, teachers corralling students like border collies. But in the middle of that chaos, Sophie walked with purpose. Her backpack hung loose off one shoulder, her sketchbook hugged tightly to her chest. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't need to. For the first time in years, her feet knew where she wanted to go. Emma was waiting near her locker, bouncing on her toes. "You ready for the mural meeting?" Emma asked, eyes shining. Sophie gave a soft nod. She wasn't smiling, but her posture said more than words. She stood straighter, her presence more solid, like she was no longer hiding inside herself. The girls walked together, drawing curious glances. Most students were used to Sophie being the quiet shadow in the back row. Seeing her beside Emma, a girl known for her laughter and energy, felt like the opening scene of a new chapter. Down the hall, Ethan stood near the supply closet, clipboard in hand. He was checking off boxes of brushes and canvas panels delivered that morning when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Elise. She wore a charcoal gray blazer over a forest green blouse, her hair swept neatly into a bun. Professional, elegant, and nervous. She fiddled with the edge of a folder, something she rarely did. "Morning," she said, voice calm but hesitant. "Good morning," Ethan replied, smiling gently. Elise hesitated before speaking again. "I know the mural project is technically under arts and engagement, but I wanted to see if you'd be okay leading more than just the setup." Ethan raised an eyebrow. You mean actually guiding the kids, teaching? She nodded. I know your job title doesn't say art instructor, but your presence with Sophie has already changed more than any program I've run. He looked down thoughtful. I haven't taught in a long time. You haven't stopped caring, Elise said. That's what matters. Their eyes met, and for a moment the noise of the school faded. Ethan saw something behind her, calm, something vulnerable, unguarded. The same woman from the bench still learning how to let someone close. I'd be honored, he said quietly. A breath escaped her, half relief, half gratitude. She smiled, just barely. Thank you? Just then, the bell rang and the hallway roared back to life. Ethan stepped aside to let students pass and Elise turned to leave, but paused. Ethan. He looked up. I know it's been 10 years, but the day by the lake? I never forgot it. I never forgot you. He nodded, voice hushed. I didn't either. And then before either of them could say more, the current of children swept between them like a tide. Later that day, the first mural session took place in the school's multipurpose room. Long tables were pushed against the walls, plastic sheets covered the floor, and boxes of paint were lined up like soldiers waiting for orders. Ethan stood at the front with a few volunteer students, including Sophie and Emma. The rest of the class filtered in slowly, many unsure what to expect. Art wasn't always considered cool here. It was extra. Optional. Until now. Ethan clapped his hands once. All right, he said, warm and confident. This isn't about perfect lines or who can draw the best. This mural is about who we are as a school and how we want this place to feel. He moved toward a whiteboard and wrote in big letters, What makes us feel seen? The room quieted. Not just what we see every day, he continued, but what makes us feel visible, valued, safe. A hand went up, a boy near the back, like being listened to. Exactly, Ethan said. Another girl raised her hand. When someone saves you a seat, when someone stops a rumor, added another. Ethan nodded after each one scribbling down their answers. You see, art doesn't just come from brushes and paint. It comes from real things, real feelings, and you're all full of them. Emma glanced at Sophie, who sat quietly, hands folded. But then, slowly, Sophie raised her hand. Ethan blinked. Yes, Sophie. Her voice was a whisper, but it was there. When someone draws what you can't say. The room went silent. Ethan's hand froze on the marker. Then someone clapped. Then another. Soon the whole room echoed with soft, respectful applause, not out of spectacle, but acknowledgement. Sophie blushed, but she didn't flinch. For the first time in years, she'd spoken in front of a room full of strangers. And they had listened. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. He nodded to her, and she nodded back. It wasn't just a mural anymore. It was healing in color. That evening, Elise stood in the back of the gym, arms folded, watching the kids dip brushes into paint and talk as they worked, some laughing, some focused, all engaged. Her gaze drifted to Ethan, who crouched beside a girl guiding her brush with gentle encouragement. Not once did he take over. He let her lead. Elise felt a warmth bloom in her chest. She wasn't sure if it was admiration or something deeper, but it was rising. Mrs. Jennings, the school's counselor, appeared beside her. I haven't seen that girl smile in a year, she said, nodding toward Sophie. Elise blinked. Neither have I. Whatever you're doing, Mrs. Jennings added, keep doing it. It's working. Elise nodded slowly. It's not me. It's him. And in her heart she felt it a shift. The possibility that this man, this quiet, broken good man, might be part of something bigger than healing Sophie. He might be part of healing her, too. Outside, the late autumn wind stirred the trees. But inside the gym, warmth radiated not just from the heaters but from laughter brushstrokes and the colors that began to fill the blank walls. And in the center of it all, a girl who once only drew alone, now painted beside others. Her silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of meaning, and she wasn't invisible anymore. The scent of fresh paint hung thick in the air, mingling with the low hum of conversation and soft music playing from a speaker in the corner. The gymnasium, usually reserved for basketball games and folding chairs during assemblies, had been transformed into a vibrant living canvas. The mural had started with sketches, rough outlines of trees, bridges the school's silhouette, abstract figures holding hands. But now, color was blooming across the wall like spring arriving early. Brush strokes in deep purples and golds. Spirals of light, shapes of connection. It was messy, imperfect, and beautiful. At the heart of it all stood Ethan, paint-streaked jeans and a smudge of turquoise on his forearm, guiding students with a quiet attentiveness that made them feel like artists, not just kids. He crouched beside a sixth grader struggling with perspective. "Try moving your horizon line a bit lower," he said gently. "Let your sky breathe." The boy nodded, adjusting his sketch. "Like this." "Exactly. You've got it." Emma and Sophie worked side by side a few feet away, filling in the outline of a tree that stretched upward with curling branches. Sophie's lines were delicate, sure, her focus unbreakable. Emma nudged her lightly. "Yours always look like they're alive." Sophie didn't reply, but she smiled, a soft curve that lit up her entire face. Then she dipped her brush into a swirl of golden ochre and continued painting. Elise stood at the edge of the gym, arms crossed, watching the scene with a complex swirl of pride, awe, and something softer, almost wistful. There was a time not long ago when Sophie had recoiled from every room filled with people. Now she was painting in public shoulder to shoulder with classmates, offering quiet suggestions and, even on rare occasion, a laugh. And Ethan. He moved through the room like he belonged there, not as a custodian, but as a mentor, a guide, a part of something essential. Mrs. Jennings stepped beside Elise, holding a clipboard but not looking at it. "Did you ever think this would happen?" the counselor asked softly. Elise shook her head, voice thick. "Not like this." "They trust him," Mrs. Jennings said. "All of them." Elise nodded. "So do I." There was more she could have said, but the words stayed lodged in her throat. So instead she walked toward the supply table and picked up a spare brush. Ethan looked up as she approached, brow lifting slightly. "You're joining in?" he asked. "I thought I might." Elise replied, dipping her brush into a soft green. He grinned. "You always did have good taste in color." She arched a brow. "That's a bold assumption. You saw exactly one of my drawings 10 years ago." "And I remember every line," he said quietly. Her hand stilled. The brush trembled for a moment before she anchored it against the wall, making her first stroke. They painted side by side in silence. The kind of silence that felt deliberate, full, and strangely intimate. Later, when the students filed out for lunch, Ethan and Elise remained behind. The wall was beginning to take shape, a tree at the center, its roots weaving into a bench under a willow, a lake beyond. Ethan stepped back, squinting at the composition. "You see it?" Elise glanced at him. "See what? The bench," he said. "It's the one. From the lake. From then." Her breath caught. He was right. She hadn't realized it while sketching the layout weeks ago, but the shape was unmistakable. The curves, the slight slant in the backrest. It wasn't just a bench, it was their bench. Their beginning. She looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you think this is all coincidence?" "I don't believe in coincidences anymore," Ethan said. "Not after Sophie. Not after you." He turned toward her, gaze steady. "I think sometimes life brings things back to us when we're ready. Not when we want them, but when we're able to hold them properly." She felt the words land in the tenderest part of her heart. "You held space for me," Elise murmured. "Back then. And now you've done it for my daughter." Ethan's eyes softened. She just needed someone to stay still long enough for her to be seen. They stood there, the mural rising behind them, a quiet testament to transformation. That evening, Sophie sat on her bed sketchbook open across her knees. Her fingers moved in deliberate strokes pencil, whispering against the page. She was drawing the mural, not as it looked, but as it felt warm hands passing brushes, faces lit with joy, the tree's branches reaching upward like questions finally answered. And in the center she added something no one else had seen. 3 figures on the bench, a girl, a man, and a woman with soft eyes and a paintbrush in her hand. She stared at the image for a long time, then turned the page and began again. This time she didn't draw in silence. She hummed, just a little. But it was a melody one her mother hadn't heard since Sophie was 4. Back at his house, Ethan rinsed out brushes in the kitchen sink while Emma sat at the table eating apple slices. "You really like her, don't you?" Emma said without looking up. Ethan paused. "Who, Miss Harwood?" he chuckled. "She's a remarkable person." Emma smirked. "You talk like a book." "That's because I read them," he teased. She popped an apple slice in her mouth. "I think Sophie would be really happy if her mom smiled more." Ethan glanced over his shoulder. "You think I know?" He finished cleaning the last brush, dried his hands, and looked out the window at the stars winking to life. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe the mural wasn't just about healing a school. Maybe it was healing something far older, far deeper. And maybe it was drawing all of them back to where they were always meant to be. The conference room smelled faintly of fresh brewed coffee and dry erase markers. It was Tuesday evening, and the monthly school board meeting had drawn a larger than usual crowd. Parents in button-downs, teachers in cardigans, and a few curious students filled the metal chairs arranged in neat rows. At the front, a long table stretched beneath a fluorescent light. The board members sat with their folders open, pens ready, expressions unreadable. Ethan stood quietly near the back, flanked by Elise and Mrs. Jennings. He didn't wear anything fancy, just a clean flannel shirt, pressed jeans, and the steady calm of a man who knew how to show up when it mattered. Still, his hands were tucked into his pockets to hide their tremble. He wasn't nervous for himself. Not really. But Sophie was sitting 2 rows up her sketchbook, clutched in her lap like a life raft. If the mural project got canceled, if he were forced to step down, she might close in on herself again, and he wasn't sure if she'd reopen. A man near the center of the table cleared his throat. Mr. Cranford, board chair. Gray hair, tidy mustache, and a voice as dry as paperwork. The topic at hand, he said, is the continued employment and scope of responsibility of Mr. Ethan Hayes, currently on contract as facilities assistant. Concerns have been raised regarding the extension of his role to include student mentorship and instruction activities that technically fall outside his job description and qualifications. The words hit like frostbite. Ethan felt Elise stiffen beside him. Mr. Cranford continued. While the mural project has generated positive engagement, we must weigh professional boundaries and precedent. If one non-certified staff member leads instruction, what message does that send? Elise stepped forward. "May I speak?" she asked, tone cool but composed. Cranford nodded reluctantly. Elise turned to the room. "There's a difference between having a certificate and having a calling," she said. Mr. Hayes didn't step into this role seeking recognition. He stepped in because a child was being bullied and no one else did. He guided students not because it was assigned to him, but because they trusted him, because he listened. She glanced toward Sophie, who looked up at her mother with wide, searching eyes. "The success of this mural isn't measured in brushstrokes," Elise continued. "It's measured in the voices that found courage, the hands that stopped trembling, the smiles that returned. If you're asking me whether I approve of Mr. Hayes's expanded role, then I do." Unequivocally. Cranford adjusted his glasses. Noted. "But we must consider policy." "Excuse me," another voice called out. Everyone turned. It was Mrs. Jennings, the school counselor. "I'd like to submit something," she said, holding up a folder. "Progress reports from the past 4 weeks. Behavior logs, peer evaluations, emotional resilience, tracking. All of them show marked improvement, especially in students considered high risk. all during the time Mr. Hayes has been working directly with them. She walked forward and placed the folder on the table. Sometimes the data speaks loudest, she added. Murmurs rippled through the room. Just then, a hand went up small, hesitant. Sophie. Every head turned. Elise inhaled sharply. Ethan's heart skipped. Sophie stood slowly. Her hands shook slightly, but her eyes held. She clutched her sketchbook to her chest, then stepped into the open space near the board. I don't. Talk a lot, she began. Her voice was quiet, but every syllable seemed to hush the room. But I see things, and I feel them. And Mr. Hayes, he didn't try to fix me. He just stayed, and he drew with me. And when people stay, you don't feel invisible anymore. She opened her sketchbook and turned it around. The page showed the mural in progress, but with a small detail no one else had noticed in the corner. 3 figures sat on a bench, one small, one strong, and one with eyes full of quiet light. My voice came back because he didn't try to find it. He just waited. She held the book a moment longer, then walked back to her seat without another word. The room remained silent, heavy with meaning. Cranford cleared his throat again this time with far less confidence. I think we've heard enough, he muttered. The board members exchanged glances. Then Mrs. Rollins, a retired teacher and longtime member, leaned toward her microphone. I move that we approve the continued collaboration of Mr. Hayes on the mural project and any student-led initiatives at the discretion of the principal. I second came another voice. All in favor. A wave of hands rose across the board. Ethan exhaled. Beside him, Elise's hand found his. It was the first time she'd ever touched him in public. He didn't move, just let the moment bloom between them. Outside, the night air was crisp and star-strewn. Students and parents lingered near the steps, some clapping softly, some embracing. Sophie stood beside Emma, who beamed with pride. You were amazing, Emma whispered. Sophie shrugged but allowed herself a tiny smile. Ethan stepped into the cool air, hands still shaking, but this time from something else. Relief, gratitude, hope. Elise joined him a moment later, arms crossed, eyes on the stars. I've been in hundreds of meetings, she said softly, but that was the first time I felt like a mother more than a principal. Ethan glanced at her, his voice hushed. You were both. She smiled, then turned to face him fully. I meant what I said, she said. About you, about what you've done here. This isn't just a project anymore, it's a story, one that's saving people. He nodded slowly. It's saving me, too. Their eyes locked, the space between them humming with something unspoken. Not yet love, but the unmistakable pull of something beginning. A line drawn in quiet confidence. A voice returned through stillness, and the kind of connection that no boardroom could vote on. They stood beneath the stars as the school doors closed behind them, 2 people no longer walking parallel, but turning finally toward each other. The wind that morning smelled of wood smoke and late October. It rustled golden leaves across the school courtyard like nature's own confetti. Inside her office, Elise sat at her desk, the sunlight filtering through blinds and slender stripes across her paperwork. But her eyes weren't on the calendar or the upcoming PTA agenda. They were on the small shallow drawer at the bottom right of her desk, the one she hadn't opened in years. Her hand hovered over the handle. She wasn't sure what had drawn her to it. Maybe it was the look on Sophie's face last night, tired but glowing. Or maybe it was the silence that had filled the car on the ride home, not from tension, but from something richer. Peace. She pulled the drawer open slowly. Inside, beneath old forms and rubber bands, was a narrow leather-bound journal. She hadn't touched it since Sophie was a toddler. Her fingers found the ribboned page with muscle memory. And there it was, a letter, folded yellowing slightly at the creases, addressed in her own handwriting but never sent. To the man by the bench, the one who didn't walk away. Elise's throat tightened. She unfolded it carefully and began to read. You sat beside me when I was pregnant and afraid. You didn't ask what was wrong. You didn't try to fix it. You just offered your presence like a lighthouse offers light, without noise, without demands. I never said thank you, but I remembered you. In every moment I felt overwhelmed, I remembered your stillness, your steadiness. I hope someone gives you that peace someday. The way you gave it to me. Tears stung her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly as she refolded the paper, pressing it flat between her palms. She hadn't known his name then. Now she couldn't stop thinking about it. Ethan. She tucked the letter into her blazer pocket. She didn't know what she'd do with it yet, but somehow it didn't belong in the drawer anymore. Across town, Ethan stood in the garage behind his duplex, sifting through boxes of old art supplies. Emma had convinced him gently, persistently, to submit something for the fall community art fair. It doesn't have to be perfect, she'd said. It just has to be yours. He pulled out a wooden box with a cracked brass latch. Inside were dozens of rolled sketches, many unfinished. One caught his eye. Unfolding it carefully, he stared at a pencil drawing of a woman sitting on a stone bench, her hands in her lap, her gaze turned slightly downward. She wore red gloves. He'd drawn it the same night he'd met her. When he got home, unable to sleep, he'd tried to preserve what her presence had made him feel: raw, honesty, quiet dignity. He hadn't known her name then. Now he couldn't stop saying it in his mind. Elise. He reached for an envelope, gently slid the sketch inside, and wrote in small, careful letters, "To someone who stayed with me, even in silence." That afternoon, students gathered in the gym to continue the mural. The bench on the wall was nearly complete now, its outline refined and shaded with quiet elegance. Sophie had added fine details to the willow tree. Tiny birds, open books nestled in its roots, a ribbon that flowed from branch to branch. Emma pointed to one of the figures seated on the bench and grinned. "That's me, isn't it?" Sophie nodded. "And that's you," another nod. "And the third one." "That's my dad." Sophie paused for a beat, then slowly shook her head. Emma blinked. "It's my mom." Sophie shook her head again. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded note which she handed to Emma. Emma opened it. Inside, a single line written in Sophie's soft, slanted handwriting. Sometimes a heart remembers before a name does. Emma stared at it, understanding blooming across her face like sunrise. "Your mom," she whispered. "She knew my dad. A long time ago." Sophie didn't answer. She just picked up her paintbrush and dipped it in silver. That evening, Ethan stood at Elise's front porch, the envelope in his hands. He hadn't called. He hadn't texted. He just knew he had to give it to her in person. Before he could knock, the door opened. Elise stood there as if she'd been waiting. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she held up a small folded piece of paper. "I have something for you, too," she said. Ethan smiled. "Then we're even." They sat on her porch side by side, just like they had a decade ago, only this time. No lake, no wind, no strangers. Just memory. And something more solid. Elise handed him the letter. He read it slowly, his breath catching once, then again. When he finished, he looked at her, his voice quiet but full. "You remembered. I tried to forget," she admitted. "But you were the one thing that stayed. Through every storm, through every silence." He offered her his envelope. She opened it and gasped softly. The drawing. She touched the paper like it might vanish. This was me," she whispered. "You changed something in me that day," Ethan said. "I didn't know it then, but I do now." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the yard. Across the street, porch lights flickered on one by one. Elise turned toward him. "Do you think we get second chances?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "I think sometimes we only get the real chance when we're finally ready." They sat there until the sky turned navy and the stars blinked awake, and in the hush between them something settled. Not closure, but a new beginning, drawn not in ink but in trust, in timing, in the quiet understanding of two souls who had waited long enough and were finally ready to speak. The wind had changed. Ethan could feel it on the back of his neck as he carried a box of paint trays across the gym. Outside, clouds thickened like bruises over the horizon. Autumn leaves danced frantically along the sidewalks, scraped into corners by sudden gusts. He checked his phone. No alerts yet. But years of working odd jobs outdoors had sharpened his instinct. This wasn't just rain. It would be sudden, strong. Inside the gym, Sophie and Emma were putting the finishing touches on the mural's lower border, tiny illustrations of things that made them feel safe. A pair of hands, an open book, a flashlight glowing in the dark. Sophie was unusually focused today, not just on the brushwork, but on something Ethan couldn't quite name. A certain stillness, like she was waiting for something to shift. He stepped over. "Hey, kiddo, that's some beautiful detail." She looked up at him, then back at the mural, hesitating for a beat before dipping her brush into pale blue. With slow strokes, she painted a small bird into the tree's branches. Then she set the brush down and turned to Emma. "I want to go to the lake," she said softly. Emma blinked. Now Sophie nodded. Ethan caught the exchange, eyebrows lifting. "The lake?" he asked. Sophie didn't answer with words. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket, the same sketch she'd made weeks ago. The bench, the tree, the figure beside her. Only now there was something new, a second figure on the other side of her. Elise. The image wasn't just art anymore. It was memory. Ethan's breath caught. Sophie finally whispered, "I want to go back." Elise was in a meeting with the district finance director when her phone buzzed. She glanced down, expecting a calendar reminder, then froze. Text from Emma: "Sophie wants to go to the lake. Now." "I think it matters." Elise stood. "I'm sorry I have to go." The director looked up. "We haven't finalized the—" "I'm sorry," she repeated. "My daughter needs me." She was out the door before he could reply. The first drops began to fall just as Ethan's truck pulled into the gravel lot by the lake. Sophie stepped out, her sketchbook in hand, her eyes scanning the trees as if expecting someone or something to call her by name. Ethan climbed out, shielding his eyes from the rain. "Are you sure about this?" She didn't answer. She just walked. Emma hesitated at the door. "Should we follow her?" Ethan nodded. "She's not running. She's remembering." The wind picked up, rushing through the willows like an old voice returning. Sophie reached the bench slowly, fingers trembling slightly as she opened her sketchbook and placed it on the wet wood. Then she sat, alone, and waited. A crack of thunder rolled in the distance. Elise's car screeched into the lot moments later. She barely threw it into park before jumping out, hair whipping in the wind. "Where is she?" she cried. Ethan pointed silently. Elise turned and froze. There, framed by rain and memory, sat her daughter. Her back straight, her chin lifted, her face calm, like she was whole. Elise moved forward slowly. She approached the bench, breath catching in her throat. Sophie looked up, and then finally spoke. "This is where you were." Elise sank beside her. "Yes." And him, Elise nodded. He was here too. The rain softened. "I didn't know then," Sophie whispered, "but I think I remembered it. In dreams. You always looked calm in that place. So I kept drawing it. I kept looking for it." Elise took her daughter's hand. "You found it." They sat there a moment longer before Sophie did something unexpected. She stood turned and opened her arms. Elise wrapped her in an embrace that felt like forgiveness, like home. Ethan and Emma stood nearby, quietly watching. "I never thought she'd want to come here," Elise said when they rejoined them. Her voice shook. "But she didn't just come. She led us." Ethan nodded. "Sometimes the quiet ones are the ones who see clearest." Sophie reached for his hand, and Emma's too, placing one in each of hers. And for a moment the wind ceased. The world held still. That night, back at home, Sophie went straight to the piano in the living room, a piece of furniture Elise had kept but never insisted her daughter learn. She opened the lid and began to play. 3 hesitant notes, then 4, then a melody, fragile but growing. Elise stood in the hallway, one hand pressed to her chest. She remembered that tune. It was a lullaby she used to hum during the first year of Sophie's life, a melody buried by time and pain. And now her daughter, who had barely spoken for years, was bringing it back, note by note. Ethan sat beside Elise on the staircase listening. She's not just remembering, he said. She's rebuilding. Elise turned to him, eyes shining. So am I. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded napkin, aged faded. She stared. You kept it? She asked. He nodded. It was the napkin from 10 years ago, the one she had wiped her tears with on that bench. He had scribbled on it when she wasn't looking. A single sentence. Sometimes not talking is the loudest way to be heard. Elise pressed her fingers to her lips. She leaned toward him and whispered, "Then listen closely," and kissed him, softly, surely. The first kiss not of longing but of knowing, not of need but of recognition. Outside the storm passed. Inside music filled the air, not loud, not perfect, but alive. Drawn not in ink, but in silence, memory, and second chances. The smell of fresh paint still lingered in the hallway as the school prepared for something it hadn't seen in years, an art unveiling. Not a sports pep rally, not an award ceremony, but a celebration of color story and the quiet resilience of a community rediscovering itself. Bulletin boards had been decorated with student sketches. Strings of warm lights hung along the corridor ceiling. Parents arrived with coffee cups in hand, squinting curiously at the signs that read, "Our Story in Color, a Community Mural Project." At the center of it, all the gymnasium doors stood open wide, inviting. Inside, the mural stretched across the far wall like a tapestry of small wonders. It was no longer just paint. It was voice. It was memory. It was healing. There were trees with roots that twined into open books, stars tucked into the wings of birds, a lake reflecting a golden sky, a bench beneath a willow tree, and 3 figures sitting upon it, none with faces drawn but unmistakably present. The crowd stood in hushed admiration as Ethan stepped forward, flanked by Sophie and Emma on either side. His hands were tucked behind his back, his usual flannel shirt crisp and clean. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but somehow filled the room. This mural wasn't about art, he said. It was about remembering what we sometimes forget, that we all matter, that we all leave marks, whether we intend to or not. He paused, then turned to look at the children around him, and that sometimes the quietest people are holding the loudest truths. Murmurs of agreement floated through the room. A few parents dabbed their eyes. Mrs. Jennings clutched her clipboard to her chest, clearly fighting back emotion. Elise stepped forward next. Her heels clicked softly on the polished floor. "I've been an educator for 20 years, she began. And in those 2 decades I've seen programs come and go. But I've never seen a project like this, a piece of work that made children feel seen. That taught us to stop, to look, and to listen. Not just to data, but to one another." She looked toward Sophie, whose gaze was fixed firmly on the mural. "Some stories are too big for words," Elise continued, "but not too big for art." Then, to everyone's surprise, she turned to Sophie. "Would you do the honors?" Sophie blinked, startled. Emma nudged her gently. Sophie nodded. She stepped forward, her sneakers almost silent against the gym floor, and pulled the cord that dropped the banner that had covered the mural's title. The Bench That Remembered, painted in looping script beneath a small painted ribbon that fluttered like wind. The applause was instant. But Sophie didn't flinch this time. She turned toward the crowd with her head-high hands clasped in front of her. And then she spoke. "I didn't think people would care about drawings," she said. Her voice was small but steady. "I drew because I couldn't say things. I still can't always. But when I drew that bench, I remembered how it felt. Safe, like someone would stay. She looked at Ethan, then at Elise. Her voice broke slightly. Now I know that's not just something I imagined. She stepped back, cheeks flushed but smiling. The room erupted in applause, longer now fuller. Not for the mural. For the girl who had spoken. For the voice returned. Later that evening, the hallway outside the gym had become a gallery in its own right. Parents milled about admiring the student sketches taped to the walls, each one paired with a handwritten caption from its creator. Sophie's sketch was there too. It showed a bench beside a lake, much like before. But this time, instead of 3 figures, there were 4. A girl with a sketchbook. A girl with a laugh. A man with gentle hands. And a woman, hand outstretched, not to pull anyone forward, but simply to walk beside. Beneath it, Sophie had written, "Sometimes it takes more than one bench to hold a story. This one held ours, and it remembered until we came back." Elise stood before it for a long time, arms crossed over her chest, not in defensiveness but in the way a person wraps themselves in something precious. Ethan joined her, his voice low. She told the story better than I ever could. Elise nodded. She felt it better than either of us ever let ourselves. They stood in silence, watching others stop and read the caption. No one rushed past. No one skimmed. Each person lingered, paused. That was the gift, Elise realized. The bench in the mural, the one they had sat on a decade ago, had held their grief, their unspoken wishes, their aching need for someone to stay. Now it was holding something else. Legacy. Later, when the building emptied and the lights dimmed, Sophie walked down the quiet hallway with her mother and Ethan at her side. She held both their hands. She didn't need to talk. Neither did they. They passed the mural one last time before leaving. "Will it stay here forever?" she asked softly. Ethan smiled. "As long as someone needs to look at it." Sophie nodded. When they stepped outside, the night was clear. No wind, just the stars above shining like flecks of paint on dark canvas. Emma waited at the car with Mrs. Jennings, her voice already animated with post-event excitement. Sophie turned to Ethan and Elise. "Thank you for sitting with me." Elise wrapped her arms around her daughter, her voice thick. "Thank you for showing us where to sit." And then Ethan bent down to eye level, brushing a loose strand of hair from Sophie's face. "You didn't just draw a mural," he said. "You drew your way home." Sophie smiled, and for the first time in her young life, she believed it. A week had passed since the unveiling of the mural, but the hallway still seemed to hum with color. Visitors kept coming, parents, alumni, even residents from nearby towns. Some brought their children just to stand in front of the painting. Some brought flowers. A few brought nothing but tears they hadn't expected to shed. No one left unmoved. Sophie had grown quieter again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not guarded, not afraid. It was peaceful, grounded, like someone who had finally come home. On Friday afternoon, Elise signed the last of her reports, shut her laptop, and looked out her office window toward the golden shimmer of autumn. Leaves drifted slowly past the glass. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the urgency to chase the next item, the next fire to put out. There was a rare stillness in her chest, a stillness that didn't demand she fill it. Her phone buzzed. Text from Ethan. "Meet us by the lake after school. Bring Sophie. No explanation. Just that." But it was enough. The lake was quiet again as it had been that first time 10 years ago, before the noise, before the distance, before life rerouted their hearts. The willow still leaned slightly over the bench as though whispering to the water. Sophie walked ahead, her boots crunching softly along the worn trail. Emma skipped beside her with a small thermos of cocoa and a bag of marshmallows swinging at her side. Elise followed her hand in Ethan's. They said nothing, but the warmth between them said everything. It was no longer tentative. It was real, familiar, deserved. When they reached the bench, Sophie slowed, then stopped. Someone had cleared the area, raked the path, brushed off the leaves. There was a bouquet of dried wildflowers tied with a crimson ribbon resting on the seat. And something else, a bronze plaque. Elise stepped closer to read, to the ones who saw what others overlooked. May this bench always remember the quiet that saved us. Elise felt the breath catch in her throat. She turned to Ethan, eyes wide. You did this? He smiled softly. It felt right. The bench wasn't just ours anymore. It belongs to all the moments that didn't need to be loud to be life-changing. Sophie stepped forward, placing her fingers on the plaque. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes glistened, reflecting the lake's quiet shimmer. Then she opened her sketchbook, her newest one with the red leather cover Emma had given her for the mural's completion. She flipped to the last page and gently placed the book on the bench. It showed the bench again, drawn in charcoal this time. A mother, a daughter, a man with kind eyes and a girl with a laugh. 4 people, no names, just belonging. And behind them, in faint lines of pencil and gold ink words swirled through the branches, we found each other not by noise, but by noticing. They sat together on the bench watching the wind dance across the lake. No one rushed. No one filled the silence with nervous chatter. The moment breathed on its own. Emma poured cocoa into paper cups and passed them around. Sophie placed a marshmallow on a flat rock beside her, broke it in half, and offered 1 piece to her mom, 1 to Ethan. It was in her own way a toast. To beginnings, Elise whispered. Ethan raised his cup. And the brave ones who go looking for them. Sophie reached for Elise's hand. Emma leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder. There was no camera, no audience. Just a family quietly formed not out of perfection but from patience, from staying, from listening to the spaces between the words. Weeks passed. Leaves fell and the first frost dusted the ground. The mural remained untouched, the sketchbook in the school display case under soft lighting. Sophie returned to her music. Elise returned to her art. Ethan painted again for himself, for joy. But one Saturday morning the school received a letter. It was from a boy who had transferred out months ago, one of Sophie's former classmates, one of her bullies. The letter was handwritten smudged slightly. Dear Ms. Harwood, I wanted to say I'm sorry for how I treated Sophie. I didn't understand how brave someone had to be just to sit alone day after day. I saw the mural. I saw her drawings. And I saw her speak. I cried. I've started drawing, too. I keep a sketchbook now. It helps me feel things I never knew how to say. Thank you for showing us how to see. Elise placed the letter into Sophie's hand that evening, and the girl read it in silence. Then, without a word, she picked up her pencil and began to draw again. On the first snow of the season, Ethan stood on the porch, hot coffee in hand, watching as Sophie and Emma built a snow bench in the yard. It was lopsided. It leaned. But they laughed and kept shaping it. Elise came out wrapping a scarf around her neck, standing beside him. They'll want hot chocolate soon, she said. Ethan smiled. With too many marshmallows. She turned to him, her expression tender. We never got the ending we expected. No, he said, slipping his arm around her waist. We got one better. Elise nodded, eyes never leaving the 2 girls laughing in the snow. We got one that remembers. And so the story didn't end in a kiss, or a final speech, or even in a painting. It ended in a bench that had waited quietly for years, holding space for the ones who needed it most and finally welcomed them back when they were ready. Not just to remember, but to begin again. Where are you watching from? We'd love to know. Drop a comment and share your thoughts about this story. What part touched you the most, and if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you never miss another story that warms the heart and inspires the soul. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and take care.